Hello and welcome back to Unsustainable. When people talk about plastic pollution, the advice usually gets very small very quickly. Use a reusable bag, bring a tote bag, skip the straw, recycle properly. And look, none of that's bad advice. But I think a lot of people have had the same experience, which is that you do some of those things and the problem still looks absolutely enormous. Plastic is still everywhere, the packaging is still everywhere, the litter is still everywhere. Production is still going up. And after a while, you start wondering whether the whole conversation has been framed in a slightly misleading way. Not because individual actions never matter, they do, but because they're often presented as the answer to something that's very obviously much bigger than individual tidiness. And I think that's the real question people are asking now. Not just, is it good to bring a reusable bag, which of course it is. The bigger question is, what actually helps the most? Because people care. They're willing to do something, but they also suspect, probably correctly, that this is not going to be solved by enough people remembering their keep cups. And to be fair, that suspicion is grounded in reality. UNEP says that 19 to 23 million tons of plastic waste leak into aquatic ecosystems every year, and it describes that as around 2,000 garbage trucks full of plastic dumped into oceans, rivers, and lakes every single day. The OECD found that global plastics production rose from 234 million tonnes in 2000 to 460 million tonnes in 2019, while plastic waste rose from 156 million tonnes to 353 million tonnes. And after losses during reprocessing are counted, only about 9% of plastic waste was ultimately recycled. So if you've ever felt like the scale of the problem doesn't really match the scale of the advice, you're not imagining that. That mismatch is real. I think a lot of the public conversation around plastic has encouraged people to treat it like a personal morality test. Did you remember your reusable produce bags? Did you rinse the containers properly? Did you refuse the plastic fork? And again, I'm not mocking basic habits. Some of them are sensible. Some of them do reduce waste and save money. But plastic pollution is not mainly a story about individual virtue. It's a story about systems. It's about how products are designed. It's about what materials companies choose. It's about whether packaging is made to be reused, recycled, or just thrown away. It's about whether laws make producers responsible for the waste they create, or whether that cost just gets dumped onto the public instead. And I think once you see that more clearly, the question changes. Instead of asking, how do I personally become perfect, you start asking, what kinds of changes actually seem to work at scale? That's a much better question, because the evidence points pretty clearly in one direction. The biggest measurable wins usually come from policy, infrastructure, incentives, and system design. Not from guilt, not from hoping millions of people will become unusually disciplined in a world designed for disposability. And probably the clearest example is deposit return schemes. These are the systems where you pay a small deposit on a bottle or can and you get it back when you return the container. Very simple idea. Not glamorous, just a system that makes the better behavior easy, normal, and rewarded. And the results are strong. In Ireland, Return says bottle and can recycling increased from 49% to 91% after the deposit return system was introduced. It also reported more than 1.6 billion containers returned by mid-2025. That's exactly the kind of evidence people are looking for when they ask what actually helps. Because notice what happened there. The scheme did not depend on persuading everyone through endless moral messaging. It changed the structure around the behavior. It made returning containers easier, more visible, and financially worthwhile, and then participation followed. That's leverage. And you can see something similar with plastic bag charges and bans. In England, the government says the carrier bag charge has been associated with an almost 98% reduction in annual single-use bag sales among the main retailers since the policy started. And a 2025 study in Science found that bag bans and fees were associated with a 25 to 47% decrease in plastic bags as a share of shoreline cleanup items, compared with places that didn't have those policies. Again, that matters because it's not just a vague awareness outcome, it's a measurable reduction in the thing itself. So when people ask what ordinary people can do, I don't think the answer is nothing, and I don't think the answer is just recycle harder. The better answer is this. There are still personal actions worth doing, but the highest impact actions are usually the ones that either change a shared system or support policies that change the default for everyone. That's where the biggest gains seem to be. So yes, some personal habits are still worth keeping. If you use a reusable bottle instead of buying bottled water all the time, that makes sense. If you avoid unnecessary single-use items you buy constantly, that makes sense. If you use a bag you already own rather than taking a new plastic bag every time, that makes sense. They're not meaningless things. I just think they need to be put in the right box. They're the floor, not the ceiling. They matter most when they're repeated, realistic, and easy enough that you'll actually keep doing them. But the most important level, I think, is institutional pressure. A workplace kitchen, a school canteen, a local cafe, a festival, a sporting event, an office procurement system, a council event policy. These are all places where one decision can affect hundreds, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of repeated actions over time. And this is something people really underestimate. They'll spend years trying to become a perfectly low-waste consumer, while never once asking their workplace why it still buys disposable cutlery in bulk, or why every event is still built around individually wrapped items, or why the bins are set up in a way that makes better behavior harder than it needs to be. That's a strange imbalance, because getting one school or one office to change a purchasing decision can easily outweigh a lot of small symbolic actions happening in private. And then there's policy. This is where I think the strongest evidence really sits. Deposit return schemes, bag charges and bag bans, extended producer responsibility, rules that make companies deal with the costs of the packaging they put into the world, reuse targets, better collection systems, packaging redesign requirements. Sure, it's not as emotionally satisfying as the idea that the world changes because enough people start carrying metal straws. It's less cute and less marketable, but it's more plausible. UNEP has said that plastic pollution could be cut by 80% by 2040 if countries and companies make deeper policy and marketing shifts, including cutting unnecessary plastics, redesigning packaging, scaling reuse, and improving recycling systems. That's a modeling pathway, not a guaranteed outcome, but it tells you where experts think the biggest gains are likely to come from. And I think that distinction matters. There's a difference between a nice personal habit and a system intervention that can reshape behavior across an entire population. The first may be admirable, the second is usually more powerful. That's also why I think people need to be careful about overestimating recycling. Recycling has a place, but it's often treated almost like a magic trick, as though it can absorb endless production if only people saw things properly. The global numbers just do not support that level of faith. Again, the OECD figure is about 9% of plastic waste ultimately recycled globally in 2019 after losses are taken into account. That doesn't mean recycling is useless. It means recycling is limited. It means the system is nowhere near circular enough to carry the burden we keep trying to place on it. So what should an ordinary person actually do? I think the answer is fairly simple. First, keep the straightforward repeated habits that fit your life. Use the reusables you actually use. Avoid the disposable items you buy constantly. Don't stress about achieving moral perfection. Just be sensible and consistent. Second, look for one shared system you can influence. Your workplace, your school, your local cafe, a recurring community event, a business you buy from a lot, your council. One institutional change can matter more than 100 private lifestyle gestures. Third, support policies that shift responsibility upstream. Deposit return schemes, bag charges, producer responsibility rules, reuse systems, better packaging standards. These all have a much better case behind them than the idea that this can be solved through consumer guilt alone. And fourth, keep talking about the issue in a way that matches reality. Not in a preachy way, or in a way that makes everyone defensive, but in a way that helps people see that this is not just about remembering your tote bag. It's about how an entire material system has been designed. Because once people see that, they stop asking only what they can buy differently, and start asking what needs to change around all of us. And that, I think, is where the more serious answers begin. And not every sign is negative either. CSIRO reported in 2025 that plastic pollution around Australian coastal cities was 39% lower than a decade earlier. That doesn't mean the problem is solved, but it does suggest that a policy cleanup and behaviour change can produce visible improvements over time. So I don't think the conclusion here should be cynical. And I don't think the lesson is that individual action is fake and everything's hopeless. I think the lesson is more precise than that. It's that some actions have more leverage than others. And if people genuinely want to help, it makes sense to be honest about that. So yes, bring the reusable bag. Skip the pointless plastic where you can, but don't stop there. And don't let anyone tell you that the burden begins and ends with your shopping habits. The strongest evidence we have seems to point somewhere else. It points towards rules, incentives, infrastructure, and shared systems that make better outcomes normal. That's where the bigger wins seem to be, and that's where the leverage is. And honestly, I think that's where this conversation needs to change. Not moving away from personal responsibility entirely, just beyond the very small version of it we've been sold. Thanks for watching.